Salams, this is People's Dispatch and you're watching the Daily Debrief coming to you from our studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani, and on the show today, on this weekending special show, we will have with us NewsClick's Editor-in-Chief Prabir Purkayastha. And we're focusing on, we're having a quite wide-ranging conversation centered on Joe Biden and the United States' framing of its foreign policy and economic initiatives around the world as a battle for democracy. They are, of course, trying to paint a picture of democracy on one side and authoritarianism on the other. We have Prabir with us to understand how actually many countries around the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, look at this context and understand the US's own credentials and the strength of its democracy. Prabir, as promised yesterday, we have you back with us. Good to have you here. We are talking, or we are using the news peg of US Vice President Kamala Harris's trip to Africa to have a wider conversation around what is going on. And Harris has made it a point to sort of avoid some of the key issues that have been dominating the news cycle over the past couple of days, including, of course, Finland joining NATO, what's happening in Israel, and several other issues. So, in that context, let's begin with the significance of this trip to Africa, and the one point which she has tried to sort of underplay as much as possible, which is that this is a kind of counter to China's growing influence on the continent.
Yes, clearly the US is worried, and in fact the larger Western powers are worried about the weakening that they have on whether it's Latin America, whether it's Russia, whether it is Africa, or whether it is Asia, West Asia and Southeast Asia. South Asia is a specific case because it's really India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. We leave that out in this matrix. But in all these spheres, they are finding that their influence is weakened considerably, and it's visible if you take the sanctions map. Right. That apart from West European countries, in Americas it's only Canada and the United States, virtually no other country that I can think of. We leave out the small little islands which America seems to shepherd here and there. But apart from that, there is really nothing in Americas, and in Africa, I don't think there is even a single country which has joined the sanctions. Similarly for Southeast Asia, again, maybe one or two, but that's about it. So they are worried that the way they could shepherd a large part of the world and using not only their influence, which wasn't that much at that point of time except for the Americas, but essentially using the ex-colonial powers. Well, if you remember, they hadn't left their colonies till much later. In fact, 47 is one of the earlier dates, India's independence. But if you take, for instance, a lot of the African countries, the Portuguese, for instance, spent a long time before they are finally kicked out of Africa. Yeah. Okay, so these are battles which are in the minds of the people of Africa. Congo has not been forgotten, Patrice Lumumba's death. Coup against Nkrumah has not been forgotten in Ghana. Various other coups and killing leaders of Africa, we have discussed all of them. All of these issues in Daily Debrief earlier. So all of this is in the memories of the people. So when she goes to Zambia, it's not without that context which has been there, and it is not that suddenly Africa is breaking away from the Western powers, but this has been a gradual weakening over the period of time. And though China is a later entrant into Africa, it has had a lot more to do with the economy. So they have spent their, they have funded a lot of the infrastructure development in Africa, the mines in Africa. Of course, they also have interest of output of the mines, but they have not interfered in the politics of the country in which, for instance, they have, say, helped with building a mine. So they bring the infrastructure in, they bring the money in, but they don't directly intervene in the politics of that country. But obviously there is an influence over there. There's no question about that. But it is not that you play A against B and decide who's going to be the president or who's going to be the prime minister based on whom you like or who is willing to give more concessions to your companies. So, they come from one or two specific projects. They don't come from the economy as a whole, which is what the Americans do and also what the French do in Francophone Africa and what the British would like to do, but British has ceded that role to the Americans in the Anglophone world. So it's really Francophone, Anglophone world, and Francophone world also inherits Belgium. Okay, the Belgians' ex-colonies, also Congo, for example, is where they then play the role. So all of this means that slowly, with American weakening, and as I said, the sanctions was a clear sign of that, the economic strength of China, and now with Russia joining hands, clearly post-Ukraine, there is that phenomenon also taking place. Russia has one advantage. It is a lot of the national liberation struggles, Soviet aid, memories. Whether it is South Africa, armed struggle that was carried out by the ANC, whether it is in Mozambique. So in all these struggles, the Soviets played a very important role, and that solidarity role, whether it is north of Africa to south of Africa, has not been forgotten. So this is what their problem is, how to fight that. And posing it is democracy versus authoritarianism cuts no ice in Africa, because all these coups were the favorite pastime of the American leaders, the CIA. We have the Dulles brothers, and their history in all of this. And of course, Patrice Lumumba is the most glaring example of that. This has been something which all African political leadership and people know. So when they come and framing it that we are going to foster democracy, people actually laugh at this because they know that how many coups has taken place and who has conducted or who has been behind the scene pulling the strings, either the Americans, the French, or various Anglo-French alliances, proxies and so on. And just recently, the Americans have trained soldiers from different African countries, and 7 of those 7 countries, soldiers who've been trained by the Americans, have been parts of coup in Africa. So this is the latest, for example. I think somebody in the US Congress queried the general who comes generally with the proposals for how the budget will be spent and so on. And he asked them, have you kept account of how many soldiers you have trained by the American, your forces, and how many have participated in the coups? They said, we don't keep this account. He said, I can give you the numbers, it's 7. So this is the state of quote-unquote democracy. And this again is what the French did and still continue to do. That is why when they talk about democracy, and I think Zambia, Fred Manambe, the Socialist Party of Zambia, he spoke about this. And he echoed the sentiments of large parts of Africa that we don't need lessons of democracy from you. Your record is known.
Which brings us very nicely, Prabir, to the next part of it, which is Joe Biden's Summit for Democracy and the participation or the lack of participation in that, again, being framed as sort of a global fight for democracy versus authoritarianism. Only 73 of the 120 nations that were actually invited signed on to that, to the joint statement, joint declaration. And even among those, several key allies of the United States, including India, Israel, etc., not agreeing to certain parts of the wording. What do you make of that whole summit and that conversation going in the wider context of the conflict in Ukraine and what's going on with NATO expansion, etc.?
Well, I would not put India as an ally of the United States, though they were at one point of time closer to the US than they seem to be on the Ukraine issue, for example, or willing to jump onto the military alliance AUK-US kind of boat. They have had the Quad, but even when they're a part of Quad, they do military exercises, but they do not want it to become a military alliance. Because India is also clear that it cannot become a subordinate ally to the United States, and US doesn't have any other place open for India, or for that matters, any of its other allies, whether it's the European Union or countries like Britain or it's Australia, all of them either have to accept subordinate ally status or they're not an ally. This is where it is, and none of the people have forgotten Kissinger's famous statement that it's dangerous to become an enemy of the United States, but to become a friend of the US is fatal. And it was also the context of Diem coup in South Vietnam. So given all of this, the credentials for the United States to speak up for democracy in the world is a bit of a joke in the views, as we talked about the African leaders, but also in the rest of the world. And when they're talking about it, it's in the context of only thing that US today is able to offer its allies is weapons. It can give finance, it can bring in finance at the cost of their companies taking over your economy. So whatever they give has that price tag attached to it. And even the World Bank and the IMF continue to play a role of being subordinate to the US interest or the interest of US companies. So this whole issue of democracy versus dictatorship has a complete hollow ring to it, as we discussed about Africa as well, for the rest of the world. And if we look at it, the US is at the moment I will not say a collapsed economy, but it is certainly an economy which is not able to cope up with what are the challenges they are facing today. And with the Ukraine war, they have a financial crisis, a major financial crisis on their hands. European Union its economy is sinking. Buying energy, it's very costly energy, buying very costly energy and not able to manufacture today at competitive rates the rest of the world, including the United States. Therefore, they are going to, it appears, they are not in a position to support anything that the US may want. And therefore, the US and its allies are not able to offer rest of the world anything except rhetoric, and the only place where they still have commanded the heights, the commanding heights, is in media. That their soft power over the media of how the news is to be read or what is to be considered news and what is not to be considered news, that is still something they determine. So that is, yes, they shape a lot of the public opinion in the world, and we have seen that in Ukraine, for example. But nevertheless, when it comes to democracy, America's democratic credentials have never been strong, and never been particularly strong. And the only reason they could frame that in Europe was because they posted against Soviet Union, and large parts of Western Europe believed that Soviet Union was dictatorship. Even Americans, shall we say, America subordinating oneself to America was still better than subordinating itself to the United States, into the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, today, the kind of growth that, for instance, Germany had in that period, it's forgotten that it was built on also resources, natural resources, including gas from Soviet Union. And I think somebody has commented recently that Germany built a $2 trillion economy based on $27 billion of cheap gas from Russia, the Soviet Union. That is the problem that they are facing today. So this democracy versus authoritarianism coming from United States, who has upended so many democracies in the world, including from Congo, starting with Congo, to Chile, which is fresh, is still in our minds, because this is our generation. So this does not cut any as the rest of the world either. So I think that is the problem that they have. The resonance of the slogan, the first summit for democracy and the second summit for democracy. The first one was essentially fell flat. The second one doesn't seem to have taken off. So we are still in the same range. That this slogan sounds empty to the rest of the world, particularly when coming from the United States, who has propped up dictatorships and oligarchs in most of the world. And that's our experience. That's not the way the West may think of what they have done.
Yeah.
But our experience is the Western Europe came as colonizers, and the Americans supported them in the period when the world was decolonizing, and they didn't want to give up their colonies. This is the picture which Africa has, which Southeast Asia has for Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and which a lot of the Latin America has, because they know that the Americans still consider Latin America is really a part of American sphere of influence, and they should not get out of that. And that, the Monroe Doctrine, is again a neocolonial doctrine. So this does not give much credibility to the slogan of democracy.
Which brings us to actual questions of, I guess, war and peace, and with the latest announcement of the Turkish parliament having ratified the accession of Finland to NATO, joining that military alliance, which, like you've mentioned before, really has no foundation because the Soviet Union no longer exists. Not a move that is likely to de-escalate in any sense the conflict in Ukraine.
You know, Finland has been de facto part of NATO. Finland's role against the Soviet Union was also there, and there's a long history about Finland, what role it played at that point of time. It didn't want to get into the NATO for reasons which, after all, was that if they disturbed the Soviet Union, Finland's agreement, peace agreement, then they could open themselves to much more possibilities that existed at that point of time. So they didn't want to really join this. Now they're joining, they thought they were joining along with Sweden. But as I said, both Sweden and Finland have been de facto NATO allies. They do military exercises with them. They have, certainly they have the CIA also coordinating closely with their intelligence agencies. They also have the host various intelligence operations
and
of the United States military forces. And let's not forget, Finland was also involved, apparently, according to Seymour Hersh, on the pipeline, Nord Stream. Finland was involved with the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage, according to Seymour Hersh. So they have been closely intricated. The Turkey's objection was really to Sweden, because Sweden gives a certain degree of shelter to the Kurdish movements. And the Kurdish movements is something which Turkey obviously hates, because Öcalan and his party, who fought armed struggle for self-determination of Kurdish areas, that battle still continues in different forms. And therefore, Kurdish forces are anathema to them. And Sweden does have a number of people who belong to Kurdish parties who are sheltering in Sweden. So their objection was to Sweden. Sweden and Finland wanted to join together. Now there's been de-linked. Turkey has said, okay, with Finland we don't have a problem. Sweden still have the problem.
Good compromise in an election year for Turkey as well.
Yes, Turkey has to also see what happens in the elections there. You're quite right. They have Erdogan has a very tricky election after having really alienated all the political forces over there. Maybe he's going to bring them together.
All right, Prabir, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much for your time today. And also that brings to a close this episode of Daily Debrief and our coverage of world news for this week. Write into us on what your views are on the Summit for Democracy and all of the other issues. Also head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on all of these stories and conversations around them. And don't forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be back next week with more Daily Debrief. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.